hope you like this. If you do, give it a thumbs up and leave any comments below. And remember to subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date on all my hypnotic bedtime stories. So I hope you enjoy the story. So as you comfortably begin to drift off to sleep, I don't know whether you'll drift deeper with the sound of my voice, or whether it'll be with the spaces between my words, or whether it'll be that you drift deeper and more comfortably asleep with the words that I use. And so as you drift comfortably asleep, I'm just going to tell you a story in the background. And while I tell that story, you can fall asleep comfortably. And there was a girl out in her garden one day. And she was playing and running around. And then she had the most unusual experience. While she was playing and running around, she saw a rabbit hole. And it was quite an unusually large rabbit hole. So she went over to that hole and peered inside, and it was dark. And so she decided to crawl inside a little bit to get a better look. And as she crawled in, so she noticed the hole got larger and larger, until eventually the hole was large enough for her to stand up and walk in. And as she walked along the inside of this rabbit hole, so she noticed that it turned from having mud all around the sides to merging into having concrete or some other man-made looking materials all around the sides, which gradually merged into looking like a corridor with flat sides and a flat roof and an echoey concrete floor. And the glow at the end of this corridor continued to get brighter as she walked closer to it with curiosity. And she reached out with her hand and ran her fingers on the wall, curious about the way that the wall had seemed to turn from mud to concrete. She could hear the way her footsteps were now echoing down the corridor. And she could look back and see that rabbit hole. And yet when she looked forward, it looked like there was a glow at a door or something off in the distance. And so, with a sense of calm curiosity, she walked her way towards that door. And when she arrived at that door, she saw that it looked like a lift. She pressed the button next to the door and waited and waited, and she could hear movement behind the door, the sound of a lift descending. And she waited and waited. And then with a ping, the door slid open, and she walked inside the lift. And she thought this was a very peculiar situation, a very strange thing to happen. She saw that there was 5 levels and decided that she would just go all the way to the bottom. So she pressed 1. Waited a moment, the door slid shut, and the lift began to lower from 5 to 4 to 3, and she could see light passing by the lift as the movement continued to happen, to 2, to 1, where the lift stopped and the door slid open. And she walked out of the lift and found herself in a vast cavern, as if somehow this lift had taken her down into a cave, and she wondered whether this cave was underneath her back garden, because she didn't know anything about this. And so she started exploring in the cave, walking around the outside of the cave initially, touching the cave wall, getting a feel for it, hearing the occasional drip of water echoing through the cave, hearing the way her footsteps echoed around the cave, and she couldn't hear any other noises in the cave. And then after a while, she saw something that looked a little bit different in the cave wall. Something that looked like it was artificial, but made to blend in, made to look like part of the cave. And she pushed against it, and she pulled on it, and she felt around it, trying to find any clue. And then eventually she knocked a stone on the floor and realised that although it looked like it was a stone that should have moved, just like a loose stone, it didn't go anywhere. So she kicked it again and noticed it still didn't go anywhere. So she leant down, felt around on that stone, and realised that it was like a lever that you could pull upwards. So she pulled that stone upwards and then let go, and it popped back down to the ground into place. And as it did, the wall beside her slid backwards and then left, opening up a secret tunnel. And she walked into this secret tunnel, feeling curiouser and curiouser the deeper she went into the experience. And the weirdest thing happened, that as she was approaching the end of the tunnel, so everything started to get lighter, as if she was walking towards daylight. And she continued walking, and she started hearing the sounds of birds and the sounds of other animals she didn't recognise. And she could feel a breeze on her face. And she exited the tunnel and realised she was part way up a cliff overlooking a vast valley with trees and grasses, and above looked like a sky with clouds, and yet she was aware that she's inside the ground, and this must be a vast cave, but she couldn't understand how. The ceiling here is glowing like normal daylight. She couldn't see where the sun was, but it looked as normal as when she's outside in the woods normally. And she saw that there was a path down to the bottom of the valley, and followed that path, and she could feel the breeze on her face. She could smell the woodland smell the wood and plants, hear the animals. And then as she looked around in the valley, she noticed something she didn't initially believe and had to double check, that it looked like there was dinosaurs in this valley. And there was pterodactyls in the sky. And it was like a prehistoric world. And some of the plants had vast, flat leaves. Others looked like unusual conifers. And apart from grasses, there didn't seem to be very many flowers that they could see. And she was fascinated by this, that somehow she had found her way to a prehistoric world. And she started exploring in this prehistoric world, climbing up trees, watching as giant dinosaurs walked past. Really getting absorbed in this prehistoric world. And then she noticed off in the distance by a lake that it looked like there was a person there. And so she thought she wants to go and talk to them, find out what this place is. So she climbed down from the tree and carefully worked her way through the valley. She had this feeling like everything was perfectly fine and safe, but she wanted to be careful nonetheless. And so she walked down the valley, breathing in the smells, feeling the grass and the air on her face, noticing the sound of each footstep. And as she continued down the valley, she could see the person was just milling around, doing something at the lake. And she got closer and closer and noticed they looked a bit like some kind of a scientist or someone. And then eventually she managed to get to where they were. And she kept just out of sight and watched them working. And they were testing the water, taking a sample. They were testing the air and writing down some notes. They were taking a few pictures. And they were wheeling something. And they put their samples on the thing they were wheeling. And they started heading around the outside of the lake. And the girl carefully followed and quietly followed. And watched as they reached a cabin and went into the cabin. And she wondered whether she should follow, whether she should knock on the cabin door and introduce herself. And after a little while, she decided that that's what she would do. She had to know what this place was. She had her curiosity, and she wanted to know. So she knocked on the door, and she could see through the window that the person inside appeared startled. But they came to the door and they saw this girl stood there. They asked who she was, how she'd found it, why was she here? And she said, those were the questions I was going to ask you. Who are you? Why are you here? Where is here? And the person invited her in. And they sat down in that cabin. And she could feel a certain coolness inside the cabin. And a certain comfort. And she asked him, where is here? Who are you? And they wanted to know the same from her. And they explained that they created this place. They've spent their life creating this place. That they've had a fascination with the prehistoric world, with saving things. And they'd managed years earlier to create this prehistoric world underground. And they're the master of this world. Their role is to watch over it, to do as little as possible in the way of interfering with it, but just monitor it and make sure it ticks along okay. And the girl found this interesting and said that she'd got there by following a rabbit hole. And the master realised that somehow maybe a rabbit, maybe a different animal, had obviously burrowed into the ground and somehow managed to burrow into one of the corridors of this base, this underground facility. And so this curious girl had followed that into this underground facility. And she had so many questions about it, about how it was made, about the size of it, about how they've recreated the sun, how they make sure there's enough oxygen and the correct composition of the air, and that the plants can grow, and where they got all these prehistoric plants and animals. And the scientist explained everything. They normally didn't talk to anyone, so they enjoyed having someone who was interested in all this, that they could talk to about it all. They talked about how this was a secret place that no one was to know about, and the girl swore she would also keep it secret. And they said that this is somewhere that they find a sense of wonder and serenity, a sense of peace, a sense of being back to a time before lots of chaos. To a simpler time. And they explained about how they enjoy relaxing by the lake, just doing their job, gathering some samples, feeding that information back, relaxing in the cabin, just watching dinosaurs, pterodactyls, and other animals going about their lives, just as they would have done millions and millions of years earlier. And they find this is their safe place, this is their place, away from the hustle and bustle of real world. That when they go home, they have to hear cars and traffic and have lots of chaos, and yet here they can enjoy peace and serenity and have a sense of wonder. And the girl appreciated all this. But she also realised that she was away from home. That as far as anyone thought, she was playing in the garden, and yet now she has played far out of her garden. So she left the cabin. She was told that if she kept it a secret, she could come visit again. And she left the cabin, wandered back through the valley, climbed up to that secret tunnel. She followed that secret tunnel, found her way back to the lift, and then back to the corridor, and then eventually back to her garden. And she sat down in her garden, relaxing under a tree, thinking about the experience she had just had. And while she relaxed there, thinking about the experience she'd just had, her mind drifted and dreamed and floated off as she comfortably and relaxed fell asleep.